IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing The Economist. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti. I'm joined by Apurva, Kumar and Suyash Desai, my colleagues. Before we begin though, just a quick announcement, a public service announcement. If you're looking to transition to a career in public policy, you should probably think about coming and studying with us at the Takshashila Institution. We offer both graduate and postgraduate programs in public policy. Applications are now open for the upcoming January 2020 cohort. You can visit our website, takshashila.org.in, to find out more. So without any further ado, over to our conversation for today, guys. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. Broadly, what we're going to be talking about is the last 2 weeks of The Economist. Last week had a pretty interesting series of articles about global inequality and the way that a lot of our assumptions about the way inequality is structured, what causes inequality, have kind of been challenged by a new wave of studies that are coming out. So we're going to start by discussing that. We will then be moving on to another big structural problem that's facing the world, which is of course climate change and where exactly the world stands on that. Finally, we'll move on to a series of geopolitical issues and look at a specific country level case studies as to what's happening and so on and so forth. So let's begin with you, Apurva. You've been reading about, you've generally been working on the macroeconomy, not just in India's case. Can you tell us a little bit about the new set of insights that The Economist says have come in?
Okay, so Anirudh, this has been like a bit unprecedented because last week, not only The Economist, but the Time magazine also ran a cover talking about inequality and how the elites have actually captured the whole discourse, talking specifically about Economist. So this particular article has quoted statistics from the research by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, who have been the pioneers in the inequality research. The article argues that the inequality levels in the world are not as alarming as we were thinking, but it is pretty bad, and the policies should be structured to address this kind of inequality. This has come at a very apt time because Democrat presidential candidate Senator Warren has sort of built her entire campaign around inequality and wealth tax. So here are the arguments by the Economist article. The article says that the source of income over the past 3 decades have shifted from labor wages to wealth, which means that the labor does not have bargaining power to get the income.
I want to give a little bit of context to what you're saying, Apurva. So I think what you described is basically Thomas Piketty's fundamental idea, right? That the more wealth you have, the returns on your wealth are always going to be greater than any other potential mode of employment for you. So you inevitably see the families that have the most assets kind of snowballing. Right? And I think that kind of really is borne out by Europe. If you look at, I think some of the richest families in Florence today were the richest families in Florence in the 1500s.
Absolutely.
So you kind of get where a lot of this discontent is coming from. But I think to correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that the data doesn't fully bear out this assumption. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So many researchers have worked on inequality, and this particular article not only talks about Piketty's research, but other researchers' work as well. And they claim that the inequality situation in the world is not as alarming as Piketty claims to. They are not refuting Piketty's or Emmanuel Saez's claims, but they are saying that so one example which they have quoted, the authors have quoted, is that the income levels of 1% in Europe have not changed in the past 20 years. So it has been high, but it has not changed. While at the same time, what has happened is that the income levels of the bottom 50% have stagnated. The productivity has risen, but the incomes level have stagnated. And this has given rise to a lot of sense of anxiety and discontentment towards the entire process called globalization. And that's why we are seeing, that's the reason we are seeing massive protests across the globe.
Okay, so to summarize again, what you're saying is the incomes of the top 1% might not have grown that much as compared to the overall amount
Right.
of income
Right.
in the economy. But the incomes of the middle and lower classes have stagnated, while the cost of living in a lot of wealthier upper income countries has gone up.
Absolutely. And the biggest casualty is the middle class. The middle class has actually hollowed out in the US and in the Western Europe. Although this article has just briefly mentioned this elephant curve, but it's the elephant curve which was given by Branko Milanovic and an economist that talks about how this middle class has been hollowed up, and because of that stagnating wages, they have there is a sense of anxiety, and that's why there's anger that's palpable, and that's why we are seeing the rise of populist leaders across the globe.
That's excellent. So for a little bit of context, right, can we talk a bit about where exactly was it that the European and American middle classes got their income from? What has really changed structurally about the economy that has caused their wages to stagnate?
Okay, so somewhere around 80s, this thing happened when the rise of Thatcher and the rise of Ronald Reagan, when the global economy was booming and the globalization was at its rise. So after 1980s and 1990s, most of the manufacturing jobs shifted to Asian countries because they were offering cheap labor and low incomes. The lower and middle income in the United States and Europe bore the brunt of it. And that's why, and it has continued. So all the manufacturing jobs have gone to India, have come to Vietnam, to Philippines and China. While the average incomes in these countries have stagnated because there were no jobs. The only jobs that were there in these countries were highly specialized jobs in the service sector, which demanded high education levels. And with rise in the fees of higher education, there were people who were the losers. So that's why it's this kind of anxiety that has built up over the years.
So I want to take the two aspects that you mentioned and kind of explore them in a little more detail over the course of this podcast. The first is the fact that you had essentially the economic growth that you see in the East Asian tiger economies was fueled by a relocating of manufacturing process from the industrialized West into the deindustrialized East, where people are willing to work for low wages. But now you also see the Asian tiger economies themselves actually slowing down. I think the Economist had an article about this as well. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yes, Anirudh. So, let me step back and talk about the relationship between the GDP growth and the exports. So, we have a classic equation where Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus exports. So C, okay.
Just
so
for
Y,
context, let's explain what that means.
So Y is the GDP growth. C is the consumption, that is the domestic consumption. I is the private investment. G is the government expenditure. And X is the exports. So we subtract the imports with the export, and hence we have this particular relationship. Now the thing with East Asian tiger economies are that their economy or their GDP growth is heavily dependent on the exports. So it's the global demand that sort of boosts their GDP growth. Let's compare this with India. In India, the biggest trigger for GDP growth is the consumption. So we are a billion plus population. We have a billion plus population. So it's the domestic demand and the domestic consumption that boosts the GDP. When we talk about the East Asian tigers, is the export. Now, after 2008 financial crisis, when the overall global economy has slowed down, and it has slowed down. There was few triggers when we thought that it will take there will be a boom, but unfortunately it didn't happen. So when that happened, the demand for these products have actually gone down. And the exports have gone down, and so the East Asian economy, the East Asian tigers are also sort of feeling the heat of this economic slowdown. This particular article which you referred to talks about three aspects that East Asian tigers should focus on if they need another sort of miraculous sort of decades. So East Asian tigers have sort of benevolent autocracy over the years, and it's this benevolent autocracy that have sort of helped them devise their state-led macroeconomic growth. So this article This article argues that with rise in incomes, the aspiration levels of the people are also rising, and with that, the state should address their aspirations and be more democratic rather than being more autocratic.
It doesn't. I mean, that's quite odd, because while you've essentially started off with an economic problem, the economist solution just seems to be democracy and freedom and liberty will solve everything.
Right, I agree. But what we are seeing in Hong Kong is something very similar. And in other countries as well, when we have decades-long GDP growth rate, the incomes have risen, people have got jobs, people have got factory jobs, but their aspirations didn't meet, and they were not able to organize themselves politically. They had no political rights, and it's these things that have sort of triggered these protests. And there are a few articles that are doing the rounds that how this kind of a lopsided capitalism has actually triggered these protests.
So for more details, we have an interesting episode coming out for our listeners which we call RNS in Review, coming out next week, which is going to be about how a lot of these global protests that you're seeing are connected to and simultaneously enabled by the new sort of political, economic, and technological environment that we live in. I'm sure you guys will love it. But I think that also dovetails very neatly with a discussion about India's own economy, India's own slowing economy that The Economist is talking about. Suyash, you've been reading about this, so I want you to connect this to what Apurva was saying a little earlier about the service sector and how service sector growth works. The basic idea being that you need to have a large high-skilled populace to really keep a service sector economy going, or you can have a large low-skilled populace that keeps your manufacturing economy going. Now, while the East Asian tigers were able to do that in the 70s, 80s, and maybe early 90s, India really wasn't able to. So most of the growth that you saw in the post-90s liberalization phase was highly skilled people moving into the service sector. And what has happened in the decades since is that even though you have a proliferation of engineering colleges, they haven't been able to meet that kind of service sector demand. But of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You have a lot more large structural problems facing us. So tell us a bit about them, Suyash.
Okay, so it's an interesting way to start a piece. So India is known for its growth story. We've been celebrated. India is celebrated in Asia for its growth story. Or I should say India was celebrated in Asia for its growth story. And recently, the news came out that NASA had our moon lander Vikram was spotted by NASA with the help of a Chennai engineer. Our Indian economic story, Economist has compared our Indian economic story to Vikram lander. So they say that it took a great leap. It rose to a particular height, and then it disappeared suddenly. So that's a funny anecdote, a funny way of putting Indian growth story. And this
so is condescending also.
But yeah, that's true. And this is despite market volatility. This is despite huge FIIs. FIIs is hot money that comes into share market. So if you see from 2018 to 2019, the FIIs went down. But in past 3 months, we have historic FIIs. This is despite historic FIIs coming into Indian market. Basically, the Economist is trying to say that despite the FIIs coming in, our policies are such that it is not allowing foreign capital to stay in for India for a very long time. This is across FIIs and FDIs. And
can you elaborate on that a little bit? Are you saying that policies are forcing investors to take their money out, or the policy environment is so uncertain that investors don't want to keep their money in the economy for very long?
The policy environment is such uncertain that there is a global slowdown, but the policies, there is no affirmative action by the state which will help investor to maintain India's story.
Absolutely, that's an excellent point. I think we've also brought up in our China report that we've done 2 episodes on recently. So if you guys haven't read that, please check it out. There are links in the description of the episode. But sorry, please continue, Suyash.
Yeah. So our GDP growth has come down massively. So this quarter, if you check the GDP reports, I think it was reported last week, GDP is 4.5%. This is historic low from 2013, if I'm not wrong, right? 2013. Also, these numbers cannot be trusted. a person working with the government has said that it is 2.5% inflated. So at 4.5%, if the GDP growth is 2.5% inflated, then we are certainly.
You mean to tell me that in 2019, India with a young population this size is growing at the rate of an elderly aging European economy?
Yeah.
That's honestly terrifying and worrisome.
Yeah, and to couple with this, there are no affirmative actions taken by the government. Let us go into details of it. Forget everything. I'll give my personal example. Yes, we're recording this on a weekday. This weekend, I went to a market to get grocery, and the prices of onions were 180 rupees kilo. Today I read in the newspaper it has crossed 200 rupees a kilo.
200, yeah.
And this onion is a staple food for many across India. So there is no positive action taken by government to control these all things. One, there is inflation. I agree that there is no food inflation across all the basket, but certain products which are staple due to structural factors are being inflated. And second, there is a rigorous concern regarding GDP growth. GDP growth has fallen off the cliff, and if this pattern continues, then the Prime Minister's objective of becoming 5 trillion economy would not be achieved in next 3 years.
It's like Boris Johnson promising he's not going to suspend Parliament. I think politicians seem to have realized now that they're actually delivering on economic promises or just generally democratic promises doesn't really work out that much. It's more about playing to your base, right?
Right.
And the fact that, look, I think a lot of governments have made their fortunes or have lost their fortunes based on the price of onions. And the fact that the price of onions is only now I think the fourth or fifth thing in the national agenda says a lot about just the way the discourse has changed in the last few years.
The Prime Minister should look into past, should just take a look at the mirror. Indira Gandhi lost her power because of prices of onion in 1970. Indira Gandhi lost her power because of the prices of onion.
Well, that was Indira Gandhi's time, and this is not Indira Gandhi's time anymore. But moving on to broader things, right? So, I think it's interesting that you highlighted the question of incentivizing foreign companies to come and stay, right? Because and incentives just generally seem to be a massive weight on the global political economy. It's not something we've generally figured out. We haven't figured out how to get rich people to pay taxes. We haven't figured out how to get antitrust regulators to not prevent mergers and acquisitions.
Land reform, labor reform.
There's just so many things we haven't figured out. But the biggest and most scariest thing that seems to be looming and coming for all of humanity, not just for any one particular nation state, is climate change. I'm sure our listeners would know that the world has spectacularly failed to meet the targets set by the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And The Economist has an article today about carbon capture and how that might be a potential solution. So basically how carbon capture works is that it kind of cycles carbon between the three big places where you can find it. You can find carbon in the atmosphere, you can find it in the biosphere, or you can find carbon underground. Now basically what we generally do is that we are burning carbon found in the biosphere, such as coal or petroleum, and that turns it into atmospheric carbon, which worsens climate change. Now, what we have the technology to do today is, for example, you have a coal-fired power plant. All the exhaust that's coming out, you could potentially have a bunch of scrubbers that capture all the carbon there and essentially store it underground, thus restoring that atmospheric carbon to the ground, right? So this is basically the idea is to kind of set up this self-reinforcing loop where even if you're burning fossil fuels, which you might need for energy needs, you should somehow be incentivized also to capture that carbon and to put it back in the ground. The argument being that since clearly the world is not interested in reducing carbon emissions, we keep kicking the can down the road, right? We just keep saying, look, we're going to emit all the carbon we want now, but eventually we're going to have technology to bring in negative emissions, and we're going to reduce emissions using these new negative emissions technologies. But the key argument is that even though you have the technology, it's not going to be implemented because, as you said, government policies keep changing, not just in India, but across the world. Funding keeps coming and going. Incentives haven't really been worked out. So while there's some interesting stuff happening in, say, California, which is actually incentivizing oil companies to use carbon dioxide that they've captured from the atmosphere to more efficiently extract oil, as oxymoronic and paradoxical as that might sound, these guys, the energy giants, are the ones who have the most money and the biggest stake in actually dealing with carbon taxes. Maybe if you were to incentivize them to kind of use carbon more efficiently, that could be one possible route to solving the global climate change crisis. But then again, I mean, being the economist, it seems to me like they kind of missed the point. The whole idea being that, at least to me, is that you cannot continue to have, you cannot solve climate change with the kind of global political economy we have, with this much kind of consumption, with fast fashion being a thing, with essentially rich people in the first world paying poor people in the third world to extract their own resources and constantly manufacture crappy products that are constantly being recycled in and out. Emissions are just the tip of the iceberg, right? We're talking about a massive, massive systemic problem. And always the countries, we talk about incentives and so on and so forth. I kind of think the Economist misses an opportunity to call out the rich countries for their BS on this matter. Because overwhelmingly the rich countries that not only create emissions but also promise to the world that they would help fund these sort of things in the 90s. And in the 30 years since then, humanity has emitted more than 50% of its total carbon emissions since then. It's an unprecedented and silent global crisis that needs to be resolved through hard diplomacy, through hard conversations, and by just freaking putting in carbon taxes, trying to work on this problem. Because at a more sort of meta-historical perspective, right, very often you come across extraordinary civilizations that seem to have collapsed for no obvious reason of theirs. And historians have always assumed that these civilizations did not have the technology to prevent natural disasters. But I think this crisis is really highlighting an important new thing, which is sometimes societies can have the technology, they can have the economic and political structure, at least in theory, needed to resolve any crisis, but in practice just not be able to work out the incentives, not be able to work out how to coordinate, and potentially lead to disastrous consequences down the line. But I mean, on that very optimistic note, we are running a little short of time. So let's just briefly talk about big news stories that we've all read this week, right? So let's go with you first, Suyash.
There is an interesting story on China in the Economist this week. China is a P5 country, and China's activism in United Nations is highlighted by Economist this week. So they're just highlighting how China is acting, how China is making a positive image despite the things that they are doing in the country. So for example, on human rights, the world, only 22 countries are criticizing China, but because of their economic heft, no one is ready to criticize China. Second thing, how positive statements are coming regarding BRI. How China is obtaining leadership positions in different UN forums, and what is the diplomatic initiative, how is the diplomacy working behind the scene. It's an interesting story to catch up.
Oh yeah, I think that's something our listeners would definitely be interested in. Apurva?
So Anirudh, yesterday the Nobel laureates in economics gave their Nobel lecture. So I was listening to their lecture. It was a pretty interesting lecture given by Professor Esther Deflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kremer. And over the past 1.5 months, there's a strong debate that has been triggered whether RCTs or randomized control trials are the best sort of interventions to address global poverty. So it's a pretty interesting debate that is doing the rounds. So I'm following that debate. We can have a next podcast on that as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a really interesting topic to discuss actually. So from my end, the NATO summit happened last week. The Economist has, I think, very correctly highlighted the fact that European leaders really see a larger place for Europe in NATO now, as the US seems to be gearing its threat perception more towards China and Asia. We will have a more detailed episode about it out this week for our listeners, so please do tune into that. On that note, thank you both for joining me in this episode, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, Check us out at our Twitter handle at @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, Storytel, and Cambly. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On Football Should Ball, Gaurav, Karthik and Siva talk about Jose Mourinho's return to Old Trafford, the Manchester Derby, and of course FPL. On this Pragati podcast, Prakhar Mishra and Pawan help us understand what state capacity is, how it could be measured, and how India can improve its state capacity rapidly. On Geek Fruit, Jishnu and Tejas discuss Ryan Johnson's new whodunit movie, Knives Out, and then talk about directors doing their best work between franchises. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by Upasana Taku, co-founder of MobiQuick. They talk about the present and future of digital payments in India and the history of MobiQuick. On Paperback, Satyajit and Racheta talk to photographer Meenal Jaiswal, who shares 9 steps of clicking a portrait picture and why we need more women photographers today. On States of Anarchy, Hamsani talks to Narayani Basu about the process of consolidating 565 princely states into modern India. Thanks and keep listening.
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists, and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue, and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research, and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.